And we're back. So we just talked about key concepts that this chapter is covering. Moving on to the next. All right, so starting with inequality. What do you know about inequality? Why do we care about inequality? Often inequality is one of the variables that people talk about at the start of the semester as one of the concepts that they care about most when they're thinking about economics and when we're thinking about the macroeconomy. So what is inequality? Inequality refers in the most basic way to the distribution of income or wealth across an economy. How much do the people at the very, very top of the income ladder have relative to the people at the very, very bottom? Do they have 100 times as much wealth? Do they have 10 times as much wealth? Do they have 5 times as much wealth? The differing answers tell us different stories about the economy as a whole. If people at the very top have many, many, many more times the amount of people at the very bottom or people in the middle, that tells us something potentially about the way the economy works, how people are compensated, how much they pay into the system, and how much they get out of it in different ways. What is the purpose of inequality? Why are there some advocates for inequality? What is the idea behind the potential benefit from inequality? And some people who talk about inequality see inequality as a motivation. It gives an incentive for people to work hard to contribute to the system so that they don't end up at the very bottom, which really offends other people who come at these questions from a different lens, that's saying, what does it mean if not having a job means that you are going to be so much worse off than people at the very top? What does it mean for someone born into a family at the very top of the income ladder to have so many more opportunities than someone who has the very different luck of being born in a family at the very bottom of the income distribution? So when we talk about inequality, we talk about the distribution of resources and the distribution of opportunities and the way that those phenomena repeat themselves over time. How easy is it for people to move up the income ladder? If we think about the American dream as the idea that anyone can start with nothing and end up a rich person by the time they die, then it becomes very important to think about how income is actually distributed, how opportunity is actually distributed, how easy it is to get a toehold into the systems that enrich people in the US economy or anywhere else in the world. Another thing that this chapter does is introduces the concept of domestic versus international inequality. So we can think about inequality domestically as the distribution of US income, what share the very top income bracket has relative to the bottom income bracket. But we can also think about international inequality. We can think about the relative wealth of different countries across the world. We can compare the US to Canada, to Germany, to Norway, to Japan, to Mexico, to South Africa, to Australia, to wherever in the world you can imagine. So this is a confusing set of diagrams that your textbook uses to explore changes in inequality over time. And what they represent is the actual distribution of income around the world at 2 different points in time. So again, this is a really tricky diagram to see. So let's zoom in a little bit, if we can. Okay. So over here, we have income inequality around the world in 1990. So the right-hand axis over here is annual income in purchasing power parity, which basically means the income or buying power of people in a given economy. And at the far end, it's annual income, so the amount that people are earning. I guess it's the same all over. So the idea here is that at the very bottom, we have in red the poorest countries in the world. And at the far right hand of the diagram in green, we have the richest economies in the world. And we see that the US is very, very, very close to the top. In the middle, we have Botswana and Brazil, and in the very bottom, we have India, Nigeria, Indonesia, and China. Now, if we move over here to 2014, we see that there's actually been a lot of movement among these different countries. So we see that the individual position, for example, of India and China have improved quite a lot. Annual income has risen a lot in those two countries. And that, as a consequence, has moved them way up in the global income distribution. We also see that there's been relatively little movement in the green. So there's been some rejostling maybe, but not much movement between, say, the US, the UK, Norway, and Japan. But what we also see is that in the middle, we see there's still quite a lot of inequality around the world. There's still a huge difference between people at the very bottom and people at the very top. But, and this is hard to see in this diagram, um, the actual difference on a country to country level has decreased somewhat over time. So, some trends your book identifies, this is what these diagrams are meant to show, is that there is large variation globally between the poorest and richest countries over time, and there's also a lot of inequality within countries. Changing placement of countries from poorest to richest over time, but there's still a lot of continuity. Many of the countries that were the poorest in 1990 are still among the poorest in 2005. And finally, there is rising in-country inequality between 1980 and 2014. And a big question that economists and policymakers ask is why? What causes in-country inequality? What factors reinforce it? What factors actually reverse those trends?